Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerry Gorman. I am the moderator for this session of Recognizing Veterans conversation. And I am very pleased to be able to be with you all today. I'd like to thank you for joining us on Veterans Day, or Armistice Day, as some veterans prefer to call it. And thank you very much to the Global Alliance for hosting this conversation and for recognizing the need to pause and reflect in the midst of so much political and public health turmoil on the needs of these often forgotten segment of our communities. I'm honored to introduce our panelists who bring with them such a wealth of knowledge and experience. I'll introduce them only briefly and allow them to fill in the details of their work. But first, I'd like to make a request of our participants today. To help facilitate the dialogue, we would like to ask if you would please type into the chat function your response to the following question. How and when do you think of the military and the people who serve within it? So again, that's how and when do you think of the military and the people who serve within it? So if you could enter your answers, your responses into the chat, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our panelists. Walida Bennett is a Gold Star mother and the director of the Multi-Faith Veteran Support Initiative at DePaul University, Chicago. Kelsey Liverpool is the co-founder and executive director of Kids Rank, founded in 2012 as a nonprofit organization to help support the social and emotional well-being of military and veteran children. And Joel Tabata served in the Army from 2003 to 2015, and he deployed to multiple overseas areas, including multiple tours to Iraq and Afghanistan. He is now a community veteran coordinator for the Multi-Health Veteran Initiative at DePaul University. So I'm sure that they will all expand upon the important work that they are doing. But to begin, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to tell us something about how your life came into intersection with the military. And perhaps to start, we can proceed alphabetically. So Walida, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank the Global Alliance for hosting this conversation today. As Jerry mentioned, I am a Gold Star mother. I lost my son to invisible wounds 7 years ago, and that really was the birth of the Multi-Faith Veteran Initiative. Prior to that, I was a military kid. My father was in the Moffett Point Marines, which were the first African Americans accepted into the Marine Corps, and they actually received the Congressional Gold Medal about 6-7 years ago. And so that really stimulated my work in terms of trying to create a community-based organization that could form a circle of support for veterans and their families when they are transitioning back. Asking the question, how as a community do we serve? Do we continue to connect with those individuals who leave for service, but yet come back to the community? So that's the connection, and that's the work that I'm doing. And throughout this conversation, we can talk a little bit more about our work, how we see it, how we engage it, and how you as civilians and residents in community can help support veterans and families in their transition.
Thank you, Alida. Kelsey?
Hi, I want to thank the Global Alliance for including me in this discussion. I actually technically am a military child. My dad was in Vietnam, but I didn't grow up with that in my household. My parents are artists. And so, but I did marry someone that ended up going into the military. And so for 17 years was a Navy spouse and traveled all over. Have 2 children of my own that experienced transition as being part of our family, and was really struck by their resilience through the process, and began Kids Rank about 8 years ago as a way and a response to a gap that we saw in support around our military children. And so the work over the last 8 years has been really revealing in how community, most of our kids go to civilian schools, and the disconnect between our civilian friends and how we engage with them, transitioning in and out every 2 to 3 years. So that's kind of how I came to be part of the military community.
Thank you, Kelsey. And Joel.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me today. So the way the military came into my life, it came into my life very, very early. I joined the military when I was 17 years old. So I spent a big portion of my adulthood serving in the military. Like Gary mentioned earlier, I spent 12 years in multiple areas, Iraq, Afghanistan, Germany, all over the world serving in the military. And now I'm here. My work in the community kind of really started working and mentoring with kids, right? Coming back from the military and trying to figure out what else I can do. Like a lot of veterans that transition, the transition can be very difficult. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I want to do in my life, and kind of realized that working with other veterans and people who have similar experiences in our communities was what was really my calling. So here I am. I'm now a community veteran coordinator with the Multi-Faith Veteran Initiative, and I look forward to having this conversation with you guys today.
Thank you, Joel. So to sort of center our conversation in this particular historical context, I'd like to ask you all, in view of where we are in this particularly fraught political moment, if you could each say a little bit about how you would define patriotism and how we balance this with the traumatic toll that military service often enacts. So perhaps, Joel, we could start with you this time if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think in these days, patriotism can be a patriot. The word can be a very loaded word, right? Especially in the political environment that we're in. I think a lot of people have taken ownership of the word patriot as if it's defined by a single quality or value that determines whether you're a patriot or not. Having served in the military, I had this idea of what patriotism was and what it wasn't. But having spent a lot of time in the community and working with people and seeing what people out here in the civilian world do for their communities, for their families, and the stuff that's going on, and seeing that how those actions kind of sustain what we do here in our country and kind of sustain our communities, and how a lot of these people do what they do to bring a better quality of life for their communities. I think those people are patriots as well. People that work for veterans, people that work to do a lot of the things that a lot of us frankly take for granted. A lot of those little details, a lot of those things that a lot of people don't really pay attention to, I think those are very patriotic things that they're doing. Another thing, and I'm thinking about the times now and what we're living through in this pandemic, right? We could think about our healthcare workers also as patriots, right? They're out there, they're putting their life in, at risk dealing with this pandemic. So I think the word patriot itself doesn't have a single meaning or isn't defined by certain values or what you believe, whether politically or anything else. I think it's determined on what you do and what you're doing it for. So that's kind of where I sit with the word patriot right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Kelsey, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, really to piggyback off of what Joel said, I agree. I mean, I believe that, really we're talking about support of our country and our country as a whole. And so, especially during these times, the landscape of what our country looks like has changed, and we have to be aware of those changes and being able to support, thinking about, I agree, in our communities, how we are impacting change. what are, us as individuals. So, I look at the military and their support of our country kind of overall, kind of the defending our freedoms and that kind of thing. But I agree that there are ways, I am part of a military family. And so I felt it was important for me, for my family, for the people that we engage with, that we do things within our community to support each other, to build camaraderie, to build networks of care and community, that ultimately that ripple effect supports the country, right? So, being a patriot is doing those things that are positively impacting us as a community, us as a nation.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Walida.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up with everything that Joel and Kelsey has mentioned about patriotism, to me, it really is, it's those actions that demonstrate humanity in service to your family, your community, your country. It's patriotic. And as Joel mentioned, yes, it's become a loaded word. It's been very, very politicized. And we have created a tension that somehow is trying to force people to choose what it means to be a patriot based on definitions that might not be applied to everyone, right? Because we what makes our country great is its diversity. And in diversities, there's a variety of different perspectives that people have. When I see Joel, who's on my team, who has a different cultural context, he is patriotic. And it looks very different, perhaps, than someone who comes from a different cultural context, but it's still patriotic. So to me, it's those demonstrated actions of humanity in service to your community and your country.
Thank you, Walida. It's interesting asking these questions in the context of what we've gone through over the past week and the emotional sort of roller coaster that we've all been through. And as I ask the questions and listen to your answers, I find myself getting very moved and choked up, and I have to keep reminding myself, I'm the moderator here. I can't right now. But thank you all for your answers. Those were very powerful. Moving on. Given our discussion thus far and your own experiences, how would you suggest we can support the physical, emotional, and behavioral well-being of our veterans and their families, especially as we increasingly realize the generational impact of military service? And Kelsey, since that's kind of
that's
more particular focus, why don't we start with you this?
No, I think we serve military kids, and it's a demographic that is often overlooked. People don't necessarily, it's not their go-to of what they think of when they think of the military. But the reality is that, more now than ever historically, military members have families with young children. And so they are going through this process of transition, separation, and all of those things that come with being part of a military family and have to endure. And so we support their social and emotional well-being and talk about how creating these communities of care are super important. So, us as an organization, we do what we provide weekly programming for the kids, which in extension supports the family. But we need mental health providers that also support them. We need teachers and educators. We need church communities and, civilian organizations that also, because if we all are doing what we're supposed to be doing, that does nothing but support their well-being overall. And not for nothing, 50% of our currently serving, or really over 50% of our currently serving, are children of veterans. And so it is this generational, and that number goes up to 80, over 80% if you take into account aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins. It is a family tradition. We're less than 1% of the population. And so because it's generational, we really have to be mindful of how we are impacting the kids of our service members, because they will ultimately, a large number of them will be military members themselves. I have 2 children of my own, and my oldest one is going to probably go into the Coast Guard. She's applying now. And so with that, I fit that demographic of that 50%, that goes in. And so we want our kids to be well adjusted, because it makes a difference in how things move forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelsey. Walida?
Yeah, I think to just kind of follow up what Kelsey said, when you think about the families and the children, particularly of military kids, we do we overlook them. We don't talk about them. The focus is on veterans, but many veterans have families, right? Or children that, if you're talking about active duty, I know that when my son was in the military, they lived on a base. And it's very insular, right? And so the kids were on the base. Well, what happens when they come back and they go into schools? I mean, we have a veteran program where we're in some schools in Inglewood. And one of the questions that we've been asking our school system is, how many military affiliated or veteran children do you have in your school system? And they cannot answer the question because they don't ask the question. It really is very similar to years ago when we were trying to track homeless children. We didn't know. Now we do, because there's a system in place. So when we talk about how we support veterans and their families in their transition, it's looking at all of these systems and trying to ask the question, who are the military and veteran people that are within these systems, so that we can at least have some sense of what the numbers are. And you can begin to say, okay, how do we best support you as you navigate through these systems? But until we have that information, it's like trying to throw something against the wall and let's just see what sticks. It doesn't work. So it really is creating an infrastructure that will help to facilitate this process.
Thank you, Walida. I know we have found similar challenges within the university system with the students coming back to resume their education and really having no way to track how many of them are veterans and considering what their unique needs might be. We've gotten a little bit better at it over the years, but I know we still have a long way to go. So thank you.
Yeah, can I just add, Jerry, I think within the educational system, because both you and I are in the academic setting, if you've got veterans that are using their VA benefits for education, it becomes a lot easier to try to plug in and to get those numbers. But those that are not using those, it's a little bit trickier. So it's really trying to figure out, how do we connect with the veteran services within institutions and have a dialogue, and how do they also begin to have some engagement across universities, so that faculty and other staff members are aware that you probably have military or veteran folks in your room. And right now we're talking about veterans, but we also need to mention that there's National Guard and reservists.
I was just about to say
and that's a whole nother issue that we don't even talk about. And so perhaps we can get to that today.
No, I mean, there are, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, there
Please.
are military connected kids in every single zip code in the United States. I mean, that's the reality. And it's because we have our active duty component, we have our National Guard and reservists and our veteran families. And not all are self-identifying. A lot live in civilian communities. 80% of our military kids go to civilian schools. So, I mean, these are things, I mean, we are amongst our civilian friends. And I think that there definitely needs to be more conversations to facilitate better support.
And also moving forward, I think we're going to come into a time, I don't know if you guys have noticed, we've been having a lot of wildfires, a lot of natural disasters, and these National Guard and Reservist kids are going to have to deal with their parents being away from them for extended periods of time. I personally know friends and have friends in either in the Gulf states or in California whose parents have been gone for 2 to 3 months fighting these wildfires, dealing with hurricane recovery. So
Unrest, all
it's
of that, yeah.
yeah, and it's definitely those kids are gonna need support as well. It's almost like if their parents are in active duty and they're gone for extended periods of time. Their parents have to deal with finding childcare, making sure that they're taken care of because they have to serve. So I think that's something that we definitely need to consider and really need to start looking at moving forward because these children are going to need support.
And thinking about, I mean, I think we tend to talk about the veteran or the service member kind of in this separate bubble from their families, when really the family should be looked at holistically, because many of the decisions that a service member makes is in support of their family. So are they going to, try to be stationed in an area that has a good school district, a safe community? Do they have resources to support my family? Some members decide whether they're going to stay in or get out of the service based on whether they have supportive services that, make them feel like they can, really be focused on their mission that they're supposed to be attending to.
Thank you. Thank you all. And Joel, did you have ample opportunity to respond to that question? I know you were responding to
I agree. Yeah, when we start thinking about veterans and supporting veteran families and the veteran themselves, I think, and this word has become very cliche, and everybody's like, well, we need to raise awareness about this, raise awareness about that. But that's the reality. I think a lot of veterans come back into the communities thinking that everything that's available for them, and the only thing that's out there to really take care of the needs, it's the VA, right? Working with an MVI and using the asset-based community development approach, we see that there are other organizations, institutions out there that can actually provide care for the veterans and their families. They don't know about them, right? So that's when awareness comes out there. I think that's why the work that MVI is doing is very important, because not only are we building these veteran communities within these communities, but we're also out there looking at all these resources and all these organizations that are out there then can provide those services to the veterans. That's why the work that Kelsey is doing, working with veteran children, is very important, because that's another resource for these children, right, that we didn't necessarily have or know about before. So I think it's very important to raise awareness and let them know what's out there. And I think that maybe that's a thing that we should start dealing with as veterans are transitioning out of the service themselves. Start looking at what's out there and letting them know, hey, there's other things out there besides the VA that can actually provide you services, and in a lot of cases, probably better than what the VA can. So that's kind of where I'm thinking at, working with veterans, being on the ground and experiencing a lot of these things with them. And I think that's very important moving forward, so that we start looking at different avenues and taking a different approach to working with veterans, instead of the same old, go with the VA, they'll take care of everything. It's not, in reality, it's not how it really works.
Yeah, and I think, Joel, you bring up an important point, because over 40% of veterans do not have a service-connected disability. And that is critical in determining whether or not you can access services from the VA. And the other aspect of that is the majority of those that do not have service-connected disabilities are veterans of color. So there's a huge issue there, particularly when you think about, we now have Vietnam War vets that are just now being qualified to access the VA for services. Well, that's unacceptable, right? And I mean, I just heard a report this morning on the VA in New Orleans and the TBIs and how they responded to veterans that were screened for TBI, but they fell through the cracks and they weren't getting services. Well, how many of those veterans went on to have a death by suicide? Right. So it's like an onion. Once you begin to peel back the layers, you really begin to see the complexity and the depth and the huge amount of gaps that we have in servicing this population that has done so much for us.
So, Walida, just the remote possibility that there might be some for whom TBI is not a familiar term. Could you explain a little bit
Yeah.
more?
Traumatic brain injury. So you have a lot of veterans who are engaged in war, who, because of their situation, because of maybe the blasts, not necessarily that they've actually had head injuries, but the blasts themselves creates these TBIs. I know when my son was diagnosed, he was diagnosed with PTSD, moral injury, and a traumatic brain injury. And the traumatic brain injury, as we know, in terms of what happens with the brain, it can alter behavior. And it may not necessarily be emotional in nature, but neurological in nature. And if you don't have a handle on what is happening, then they're misdiagnosed, they're not treated, and it could end up with some really unfortunate outcomes that ultimately impacts the family.
Yes, thanks for that clarification and that very important addition to the conversation. So we've touched on some of this already, but for those of us who are not actively engaged in working within the veteran community, as all of you are, can you help us better understand the unique needs of the returning veterans as they integrate back into our communities? I know you've mentioned some, but if you could perhaps expand upon that and what you believe to be the greatest gaps in our reentry resources, particularly given, as you use the term, Walida, the invisible wounds that people are returning with. How can we who are not in your position be better able to recognize and advocate for the needs of that community?
I think I'm going to ask Joel to respond first to that question, and then I can follow up.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the things that we need to do, and it comes for us that are out there working with these veterans. We need to start ensuring that one, the stuff that's available in the community, all these resources that are available in the community. I think we need to have a better grasp of what's around us. One, and and see what is it that they do that can be of benefit to the veteran and their family. One thing that we've noticed, and Walida has seen this over the years, has been that a lot of organizations and institutions that are in our communities don't know that a lot of the people that they are serving are veterans, right? So how can they provide a certain level of care when they don't really understand what's around them? One thing that I have, and I think that's one of the bigger issues, is veterans that have mental health issues, whether they're dealing with PTSD or TBIs, don't want to use VA services. So what can we do in our communities, or as a service provider, what can you do to make sure that you have the knowledge to be able to help these veterans with this unique issue? A lot of people that work in our communities that work with PTSD don't necessarily know how to work PTSD with people with PTSD that have suffered that trauma in war, right? In a war zone. So it's different. There's a different way to treat this. I personally, as a veteran myself, I suffered a TBI in 2011. I'm pretty open to talking about this. So that experience kind of has shaped where I'm coming from. Fortunately, I received good care at the VA, but I was one of the few. I was recommended a doctor who does a really good job at the Jesse Brown VA here in Chicago. But I know that a lot of people don't experience they don't have the same experience that I have. So I think if we do a better job at seeing what's out there and knowing what's out there, and when our veterans come to us, a lot of the time they won't be open about them telling you that they need assistance, because at the end of the day, they've been used to taking a lot of care of a lot of these issues themselves, and now they're out here in a very different world. That a lot of the time, I'll give you an example. I enlisted when I was still 17 years old. My parents had to sign off for me to go into the military, and I came out as an adult, having spent a lot of time in the military. So I came out here. It was a whole different world than from when I last remembered. So it's very difficult to try to move into different, see how things work here, how things work there. It's different. I was a child when I went in, and when I came back, I had served 4 tours in combat. So it's completely different experience in a complete different world. So having people that have known how to deal with veterans who are transitioning, it would have been a big help. I kind of had to figure that out on my own. And now that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing now to help veterans make that transition and let them know the stuff that I didn't know when I got out. So I think that, at least for me, I think that's a good approach. I know there's a lot of different approaches to help with this issue, but I think being aware of how to work with veterans who are transitioning out and their unique needs is key to making a better transition for veterans and their families.
So the work that NVI does is we provide a variety of education and training opportunities for the communities that we're in and organizations that are in the communities. We focus on military cultural competency, we focus on PTSD, moral injury, the particular and unique needs of women veterans. And what we hear from veterans themselves in terms of transitioning out, and this is, how do you begin to work with the Department of Defense when people are getting ready to exit out? They do a very good job during basic training, but in the transitioning out, there's very little training that takes place that helps connect the veterans to the resources that are on the ground. Some of the transition issues that we are aware of, our veterans, they're disconnecting, as Joel talked about. He spent a significant portion of his life in the military, which really shaped him because he was so young when he went in. His identity was wrapped into the military. Well, what do you do with that when you come out into the civilian community? And the civilian community is very different, right? And you're trying to figure out, well, where do I fit? Because there's an identity that you have that doesn't quite fit in the civilian community. You left your family and your family is thinking that you're the same person that left, but you're really not. You're very different. So really trying to understand what those experiences are like and how do you connect with the people that are in your community. And because we work primarily with veterans of color, they're coming back sometimes to communities that have high rates of trauma existing already that continually serves as triggers. One of the policies or the tools that we use, every community that we're in, we do an environmental scan. And in that environmental scan, what we attempt to do in 10 categories is identify who are providing the services in those communities. Who are those organizations? What do they do? What kind of services do they provide? And where are they? Do they have geographic boundaries that may not meet within the veterans that fall into those communities? And then what we try to do is follow up with them to ask very specific questions in terms of what Joel talked about. Are you serving veterans? If so, how do you serve them? And do you know? And bringing them together in a network where we have our sites and the providers that are in that community that meet up until COVID, that we're meeting on a regular basis to really begin to kind of talk about, well, what are the services in the communities that are available so that when a veteran and a family needs services, you have a point in that community that can help connect you to the services that are accessible in that community. Because as Joel indicated, everyone does not have the same experience at the VA. Everyone can't go to the VA, and some people just simply will not go to the VA. So what do the rest of them do? So it's really trying to figure out where the connectors are in the community and how do we provide them with the necessary information so that they can support and engage with veteran families in a way that's responsive. And education is the key, because many individuals that are working with veterans really don't understand this population. It's a very specific population.
And I mean, I just want to piggyback off that because really, I mean, we come from the lens of the military and veteran child specifically, and military children cannot be seen for mental health at the VA. They are referred into the civilian community and are seen by civilian providers. And so what happens is you have a varying level of understanding of military culture within your civilian providers. So if there is no understanding, it impacts maybe not the diagnosis being incorrect, but how it's communicated with family. So you're working with a population where mental health is still a stigma, even though they're trying to normalize that and make, understand that it is okay to seek out help. But the reality is it's still a stigma. And so, you have mental health providers that sometimes are sometimes tone deaf to what is experienced in military culture. What happens in terms of transitioning, what happens, that kids may be experiencing anxiety or depression and those kinds of things. And you have to be mindful of how you're communicating that or how you're speaking with their families about what that means. And so I agree with Waleed, like this conversation completely, like it's about education. It really is. We're doing Kids Rank, we're working on, we've really focused a lot of our efforts on the mental health and well-being of military kids over this last year, especially. And we have we actually have a conversation series. The next session is next week on family, specifically talking about these differences in an active duty family versus a National Guard family versus a veteran or reservist family. And how do we best, our civilian friends and community, how can we educate everybody so that as we are transitioning in and out, either through, service being completed and you need to transition back into maybe your home state and, your civilian community doesn't really understand what's going on, or those active families that are moving in and out every 1 to 3 years and only there for a short period of time. And so we have found, us with this specific lens on military children have identified in our conversation series organizations that are best practices. There are organizations overall. So next month we're going to be partnering with Focus, which is a family-based program out of UCLA that looks at the family holistically and works with the service member, their spouse, and the child, and then brings them back together to work as a unit and how they are dealing with transition or separation and those kinds of concepts. And so, it really, there's a lot of information out there. And to Joel's point, like it just is about getting it out, and really making sure that people understand, because then you give, it's a fighting chance, right? You give the best opportunity to have people thriving in your communities, which is what you ultimately want. You have people that are service minded, that are, used to giving, right? You sign up for service. You have made the ultimate sacrifice in terms of giving back to your country. And a lot of people get out of service and have that, military families have that mindset, ingrained in them. And so they are an asset to communities, and really, with the proper support, with the proper understanding could, make communities thrive.
Thank you. At this point, I want to encourage our participants, if they have questions or comments for our panelists, to please type it into the chat, and we will convey them. And as you are doing that, we did have a question, and this is for Kelsey, at least first of all for Kelsey. They ask, the statement is, I am curious if Kelsey finds civilian schools are open to working with Kids Rank.
Yeah, we actually are in 6 different civilian schools. Like I said, 80% of our military children go to civilian schools. So we're locally based in Illinois, and we have 6 schools that we work with, and we either go in within their school day, like at lunchtime, or directly after school, and work with their groups of military children. It's funny because initially when we started the first school we went into, the principal said, if this had been a couple years ago, we would have gotten a lot of pushback from other civilian families about you coming in, that it was exclusive and that, that they had their feelings about the military. And so they wouldn't have wanted it. And so we've seen some change and more acceptance. And, our thing is always that we want to have this group because we found time and time again, and it's showed as a productive factor to have kids, veterans do it. They have veterans group because to be in a group of people that understand what you're going through is powerful. And so for these military children to have each other and be able to have shared experiences, not have to explain why, their dad or mom might be away and they might be living with a grandparent, or to have to explain that I'm moving for, this is my third school within, 2 years or something. Like, they don't have to explain those challenges, but it doesn't mean that they're need to separate themselves. So we do a lot of programming where we'll invite their civilian friends in to meetings with us to either participate. We do a ton of service as part of our program, that they might do a service project with us. When we do pinning ceremonies, the kids get pinned like their parents, like if you've seen service members with their racks of ribbons. We have our kids, they're pinned for their accomplishments within the program. They invite their friends to experience that sense of accomplishment with them. And so it's an opportunity really to bridge the gap as opposed to create a deeper divide. But yes, that's the goal, is to be a national organization, and working with school communities is a huge piece of that. We did work with the Military Child Education Coalition, which is a wonderful organization that works around advocacy for education of military kids, because it's difficult. You move from one community to another, and school districts are different. So you have high performing and low performing school districts. The kids don't really get a choice in that, right? And so Military Child Education Coalition, they look to try to help to level some of that playing field, but they do that through some of the education that they do. So we had them come out and do a workshop we were originally for our staff around supporting the social and emotional well-being of the military child, but we invited our teachers, we invited administrators, we invited other leaders in the community to participate in this workshop, because it's not just about us. I mean, if the end goal is to have well-adjusted children, we need to share all this information with everybody so that we all are getting information that will be valuable in supporting, the student body. So education, providing programming, but then also helping to educate the educator.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelsey. So it's in everything that you have said thus far, the intrinsic importance of education is coming through. And in terms of the comments that our participants had offered at the beginning, in invitation to the question to say how and when they think about the military, one of our participants replied, "I really do not think about the military. That is actually the reason I'm attending this program." So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of keeping this as an issue that is front and foremost in the minds of the general public when we are not actively engaged in very visible wars. When we naturally tend to focus on the needs of the military. But do you have any suggestions for the rest of us who are not working with the veteran community, how we can interweave this more into our national dialogue and keep the focus where it needs to be?
I mean, I think you start by having conversations that are in your individual place base. I mean, thinking about, do you have family members that have served? And if so, how then do you engage with them, right? I think having conversations like this, where you not only have people that are working in the veteran space or military space and veterans themselves, but those that did not serve, the civilians, creating environments where you can have this cross dialogue. I think one of the reasons why, if people don't think about the military, it's only 1% of the population. We don't have a draft. So we're in a time where That's not a forefront thought because we don't have a draft, but people are still signing up. They're still joining the military, right? It's just that they're doing it in probably invisible ways because, again, we do not have a draft. We have a volunteer army. So unless there's someone that says, hey, I'm going to join the military, then no, you don't think about it. The engagements that we've been in, Iraq and Afghanistan particularly, they're not in the forefront anymore, but they're still there. We're just not bombarded with it every single day. So it really begins by intentionally having conversations about who are the veterans that are in our own sphere that we can begin to engage in. And not necessarily probe and say, oh, tell me every little thing that happened to you, but would you be willing to share your military experience so that there's some understanding of what their experiences is, and then asking them, what kind of support can I provide for you? I'm not sure we ask that. We say thank you for your service. And it's interesting because it's Veterans Week. And, each of us have probably been engaged in a variety of different activities all week. And we're really easy to say thank you for your service. But how often do we say, how can I serve you? To those that have served us. And I think that's the start.
Thank you, Alita.
Some of the things that come to mind, and there's two different approaches two different things that I think about. Is one, I think a lot of us veterans don't do a good job at self-identifying as veterans, because there's a lot of stigma that comes with being a veteran, in particular when we're working with our coworkers, or like, we don't want them to think, oh my God, he's a veteran, he's a crazy veteran that's here in the office, because believe it or not, a lot of people think that stuff, and I'm saying this from experience, and not where I work now, but previous employees, right? Like, oh, he's a veteran, like, but they have there's this stigma to working with a veteran, and then other veterans that I work with, right? Just yesterday, I had a conversation about that. So a lot of veterans don't self-identify, and two, a lot of the times, a lot of these organizations that we work with, we just don't ask a simple question, right? A lot of the people that want to receive service a lot of time have people fill out simple forms, right? Fill out a form here. Well, just ask the question, right? Are you a veteran? Are you a veteran? That would give you a better understanding of who you're dealing with, right? And then if your organization is tailored to provide certain services or not, you could take a different approach then. But a lot of times we don't ask this question. Are you a veteran, right? Even within the young government itself, a lot of the time we can't help our veterans that are involved in certain situations because we don't know that they're veterans, right? A lot of policies that are written do provide certain benefits to veterans, but we can't help them because we don't ask. So if a simple answer would be just to ask the question.
And just to follow up with what Joel said, I sit on the City of Chicago Veterans Advisory Council. And one of the questions that we've been trying to ascertain is how many veterans are city employees, because they do try to at least have some quote unquote set asides to, give them first access to employment opportunities, but they don't know. And so what we have been trying to do is help them to create a mechanism where we can ask that question and identify, well, how many veterans actually are city employees? So if we can start with government agencies, because people don't necessarily self-identify, it really boils down to, how do you ask the question? Just ask the question.
Thank you. Kelsey, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I have to say, honestly, before I was married, I've been in military community now for over 20 years. But before that, I didn't really think about the military in that way. It wasn't a part of my you know, I grew up in a city in Philadelphia, and it wasn't part of my everyday experience. And so being a part of it now, I feel like everybody I know is military, but that's just because of the work that I do, I think. But, you know, so I actually don't fault civilians, you know, for not thinking about it, because you go about your daily life and there's just so much stimulation overall on, you know, with everything that's going on. But this existence happens. I mean, you know, there's always going to be a U.S. military. It just is what it's going to be. And so that means that they're going to have families and children and all that is attached with it. And it's a lot of responsibility. And now, because it is such a small population, it is generational. And that type of responsibility, it has a lot of weight. And so I think that being able to recognize who these people are in your community, being able to better provide services and support is hugely important, because it's a choice that people are making, but it's for the greater good of the country. So, I mean, I think that it just seems to me that that would be, I don't know, the right thing to do. I'm biased though.
Thank you. So we are coming down to the dwindling moments of our time together. And once again, in recognition of this particular historical moment that we find ourselves in, with a probable new administration and changes at the state and local levels as well, based on everything that we've talked about today, do you have any specific policy recommendations for our present and new government officials to try to address these needs that you have identified?
Joel?
Yeah, Joel, you look like you did.
Well, I have a lot. I have a lot. And throughout the years, I've worked, you know, on passing and working with legislators to kind of come up with ideas for legislation, and in some cases help writing the legislation, right? So one of the biggest issues that I know and that I've been working, you know, towards rectifying for a big part of my life now is veterans deportation. We have a lot of veterans who served in combat, who have been injured at war and stuff. Long story, a lot of them are getting deported, right? I think moving forward with the new administration, I know we've done a lot of outreach previously with the previous administration, and we haven't been successful in those, you know, through that avenue. But one of the things that I'm hoping for is with the new administration is to rectify this issue. I think the issue itself can be rectified fairly easily, because a lot of the causes that are a lot of the reasons why these veterans are being deported is because of policies in individual agencies. So I think if we could start addressing those policies and start reversing a lot of those policies within those agencies, I think we can make an immediate impact. But at the end of the day, I think there's definitely some legislation that needs to be worked that would prevent this from even happening in the first place. So number one priority for me with this new administration would be ending the deportation of military combat veterans.
Yeah, and I think to follow up with what Joel indicated, trying to, where he talks about that some of them are wrapped up in policies of other agencies, we cannot look at the deportation issue of veterans from an immigration perspective. It has to be separated out from the immigration perspective. It's a veteran military issue, and we need to see it as such. I think, you know, the ongoing issues with the VA and the policies around healthcare and making sure that veterans that can access the VA are able to do that, but they're also receiving the best possible care, and really looking at those policies. During the entire campaign, I did not hear either candidate talk about veteran issues, right? So we're hoping with this new incoming administration, we can put veterans back on the agenda And those veteran service organizations that have a real understanding of key issues that are impacting veterans can be at the table to help them develop some of those policies. Yes, we do program in our community in terms of connecting veterans to community support, but at the end of the day, if you're not dealing with policy, it really doesn't make a bit of difference. You've got to change some of those policies that really impact the way that veterans are able to navigate through their transition. And we also have to really heighten, particularly the work that Kelsey is doing around military and veteran children. It's key. We do not talk enough about what is impacting veterans and their families, and those families that are supporting veterans that not only have invisible wounds, but also have physical wounds. Who is helping those families to really navigate these systems? And we get calls all the time from people looking for services because they just don't know where to go, or they've been turned away, and trying to connect them to those services. So I think that those particular policies is something that we really have to work on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, for us specifically, like, there just needs to be more conversation around military and veteran kids. The research is only about 20 years old, so there are no real longitudinal studies on the impact of military lifestyle on the kids. And so, you know, while there's some policies which are really great around education for military kids, we need to really start thinking about their mental health and well-being, and how we are addressing it, how we're providing safeguards for them, and, you know, where we're able then to really, within agencies, provide support to help them. So yeah.
One last thing, and I'm sorry, I'm going to summarize this very quickly because I know we're short on time. But one other issue that I think is very important, and I think we deal with it more than we would like to, is veterans dealing with substance abuse. A lot of the times and you know, in our own government, through their own reporting, has verified that substance abuse, a lot of the times, is due to the trauma that the veteran experienced at war, that they resorted to a lot of these substances to deal with that trauma and those experiences. So I think working with veterans who have been discharged from the military because of substance abuse, the military has now recognized that a lot of them resorted to these substances because of the trauma that they experienced and the inadequate care that they received while they were in the service, and they still get negative discharges from the military. I think we need to work to rectify those inequities to begin with. Because a lot of our veterans, and this, you know, these are veterans from all walks of life, from all different parts of the country, who deal with substance abuse because of their experiences within the military. So I think if we deal with that issue, I think we can make a big impact. And it's already an issue that the military has already identified that they failed at, right? So there's already a structure there to deal with it. Now let's actually deal with it through policy. Because they need the care, and we need to start dealing with it, because it's something that's happening, it's something that we live with. And then our veterans are out here and back in their communities with those same issues because they were just dumped out of the military because of those issues. And we know that they're not only dealing with substance abuse, they're dealing with PTSD because of their experiences in war. And a lot of the time, these veterans suffer traumatic brain injuries. You know, this, Walida mentioned it earlier, it's an invisible injury, but it's there. And they need to receive the care that they deserve because of their injury in service to our country, that they can no longer receive because of their negative discharge. So there's a lot of different, you know, mechanisms there that need to be, a lot of levers that need to be pulled to make this work. But it definitely needs to happen because it's something that we live with on a daily basis that needs to be addressed.
And I know we don't have time, but just to mention that the substance abuse issue is a huge issue, and really accounts also for a number of veterans that now are engaged in the criminal justice system. So that's another issue that, you know, we really need to, you know, kind of think about and talk about when we think about veterans that are engaged in the criminal justice system as a direct result of some of the experiences that they've had in war. So
And then I have to chime in and just say, do they have kids?
Yeah.
Because they go through all of this, and then their children then have to go through this process as well. You know, a lot of
Exactly.
kids are caregivers for their parents, you know, and that's a lot of responsibility on a young person, and have lifelong impact. So.
Well, thank you all so much for what was really a very rich and enlightening conversation, and which obviously could go on, but we are out of time. So I want to say deep gratitude to Walida, Kelsey, and Joel. It was an honor to be with you on this important day of remembrance. And thank you once again to the Global Alliance for this opportunity. So you have given us all lots to think about, and a good platform for action going forward. So thank you all so much. Thanks to all who participated.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch over email.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.